Hello and welcome to Miniature Adventures. I'm Big Lee, and this week I want to talk about buildings and getting the scale right in your games. So this week I'm returning to answering some subscriber questions. As some of you may recall, I put out a call for questions and subject matters that I could discuss months and months ago, and I'm still working through some of the questions I got. So this is a question from Jack Chisnell. Thank you, Jack, for the question. And he asked, how do you deal with the problems of buildings if they are to scale, or are they far too big for the table? And this is an interesting question that deserves a proper answer, and it is one that often gets discussed in my current group, the Posties Rejects. In fact, we've been discussing this very subject in the last couple of weeks, so I thought this was perfect time to try and answer Jack's question in a little bit more detail. So back when I originally answered the question in the comments, I speculated that a lot would depend on the type of game you are playing. You know, if it's a skirmish game where individual figures need to be able to move in and out of buildings, then you'd probably need to go with the scale that is comparable to the figures, regardless of the footprint of the building. But for larger games, on say a brigade level and so on, then the footprint of the building is less of a factor, and you could use smaller buildings to represent towns and so on. And one of my friends in the Redux did exactly that for his French Revolutionary game. His figures for the game were 28mm, but he used 15mm buildings, quite tall ones, to represent the towns, so that you ended up with a town that consisted of 3 or 4 buildings, but without taking up half the table in footprint. And I'll put a link to Richard's blog in the comments below, where he has been discussing this very subject very recently. He routinely uses buildings of a scale smaller than the figures that he's playing with. And it's an interesting approach. It works sometimes. I don't think it always works, but it depends on your own personal aesthetic and, like I say, the type of scale of game that you're going to be playing. So in the periods that I've collected so far, I've not actually encountered this problem a lot. You know, even in my skirmish level games, where the figures need to enter the buildings and so on. So thinking of Chain of Command in particular, as most recent example, it's a subject that hasn't come up because I need buildings that are of the right footprint for the figures, so that I can move men in and out of the buildings and so on. And then I've also played a lot of large-scale tactical games like my Punic War collection, and there's very few buildings on those ancient battlefields often, or at least the games that I've been playing. So I haven't really had to encounter or deal with this particular issue before, but I might do in the future. I've found that there's been very little need for me to think about buildings and their footprint, but having seen Richard's examples for the games that he's been playing, I'm kind of going along his idea and thinking of using smaller scale buildings for larger figures to represent whole towns and farmsteads in a little bit more realistic looking way. And indeed, my next project, which is going to be the Wars of the Roses, yes, folks, I was pretending to think about it, but the reality is I was going to do it. I'm going to need to incorporate buildings, villages, towns into my games, because a lot of the battles took place around those sort of features, and therefore I need to make a decision. Am I going to have buildings that are the right footprint, or am I going to make it more representational? I'm yet to buy anything for this period yet. I've just decided this is what I'm going to do. I now need to go out and do some research, because obviously I'm going to be buying 6mm figures for Wars of the Roses, so maybe I need to consider 2 or 3mm buildings. So I've yet to even start looking there, but I think that's the way I'm going to go, so that I can represent a town or a village in a much more pleasing way on the table. However, I am of the opinion that worrying about the scale of buildings versus the figures is really a question of aesthetics. Our tabletop games are a simulation after all, particularly in large battle games. Units of hundreds of men are represented by a fraction of their number in miniatures. Ground scales are correspondingly reduced to keep ranges of movement within a reasonable 6-foot table, and even some vertical scales, hills and trees, are often reduced to keep terrain manageable on a games table. You know, if you had a 28mm figure and a realistic scale tree, it would be huge on a games table. So we may make compromises all the time. I've discussed this before. When we play our games, we like to pretend we're being realistic and we've got the right numbers of buttons and the right shade of collar on our men, but the reality is all of our games are, to a greater or lesser extent, compromises, and that particularly includes scales and so on, of the different elements that are on the table. And if we're going to apply that principle to other things like grand scales and how many men are in a unit, then why not the same principles being applied to buildings as well? So as usual, I'm going to throw this out to you and ask, how do you approach building scales in your war games? Do you, like me, are developing a mixed approach depending on the type of game that you're playing? Or does scale discrepancy make you twitch? There's nothing wrong with that. Please leave your experiences, your perspectives in the comments below, and I'd love to know how you've tackled it for different types of games. If you're predominantly a skirmish game player, maybe this isn't something that's even crossed your mind, but if you play large scale big battles, maybe you have thought about this before, or maybe you haven't and you're suddenly thinking it's a good idea. I'd love to hear what you think on this whole subject. So if you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe and share, and if you want to keep up to date with weekly content from this channel, please tap the bell notification icon. So until next week, as always, stay safe, keep gaming, and of course keep rolling high.